Welcome to Dialogue CISAD, a series where we talk about the most present and current issues in international relations. My name is Viera Carolina López. I come from the Dominican Republic, and I'm a student of the ISAD Master's Program and the second year at the Jagiellonian University. Today, we have with us the honor to be guesting Dr. Víctor Mijares. He's a political scientist and associate professor in la Universidad de Los Andes, specializing in international relations, geopolitics, and security studies. His research focuses in Latin America petrostates, especially Venezuela, and how resource dependence shapes foreign policy, state stability, and regional security. He has published extensively on topics such as hybrid defense doctrines, the collapse of UNASUR, and the shifting geopolitical alignments in the Americas. Mijares combines rigorous theoretical approaches with empirical regional analysis, offering influential insights into the dynamics of the Latin American international politics. His work is widely recognized across academic and policy circles for clarifying the complex relationships between energy, authoritarianism, and regional order. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're very happy to have you here, Professor. It's a great honor, especially because in international relations, at least, we're not really focused in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I think it's a region of much importance, which must be given more attention to. We would like to ask as our first question, what was the political and social influence of the Cold War in the Caribbean?
Well, the Cold War was a major issue in the Caribbean, considering that it was the security area of the United States for for much time. Um, and during this first year of the Cold War, the United States dominated the region. However, the Soviet Union project its power to the region, to the Caribbean, and then they have, a major success with the Cuban Revolution. So after that, the Caribbean became a region of disputes between the United States and the Soviet Union. And after that, of course, the projection and the spread of the Cuban Revolution from the Caribbean to Central America and also South America. So actually, of course, it shapes the politics in the region, but the culture wasn't, completely penetrated by this war because the culture in the Caribbean is so old. The culture is very antique and related to the main components of the native roots with the African component and the Hispanic history. So I think culturally the changes came to the Caribbean even before the Cold War. For instance, baseball was an important ingredient from the United States, but also all the culture in the kitchen, the food, the music is even before the Cold War.
You mentioned baseball, and I find it very interesting given the Cuban Missile Crisis and how the United States realized the presence of the Soviet Union in there because of the football soccer teams.
Yeah.
So I thank you for bringing that up. From your perspective, what makes the Caribbean region geopolitically unique within the broader Latin American context?
Wow, this is a great question because most Latin America is a huge continent, as you know, and we have the big South American countries with vast territories with a lot of resources, huge populations. Considering, of course, the dimensions of Latin America. Then you have, some medium to small states in Central America, but the Caribbean is completely different. And considering that we have there not only continental countries like Colombia or Venezuela, even part of Mexico and Central America, but also island countries. And these island countries create this archipelago with many cultures, and Anglo-Saxon culture, Dutch culture, Hispanic culture, and even French culture. So this is a melting pot, but not that melting at all, because we have this fragmentation of culture. This is not a continental space. This is not a land space, but a maritime space with this fragmentation, with many ideas, many languages. It makes this region really special in terms of geopolitics. Also because it's the natural security area for the United States, and that's the reason why the new national security strategy is, trying to repositioning the states in this particular area, and with very important focus on the Caribbean. So this is, of course, one of the most important and one of the most thriving sub-region within Latin America.
Thank you. How, in this sense, how do you believe that external powers such as the US, China, and the European Union shape political and security dynamics in the Caribbean today?
Well, um, let me let me start with one sentence that I think this is important. The Caribbean has been always a sea of empires. So, even before the Spaniards, many groups, dispute the control of the many islands in the Caribbean, and also after the Spaniards, the British, the Dutch, the French, and then the Americans, the Soviets. So the Caribbean has been always a sea in which empires clash each other for the control of many passes, many trade, and of course geopolitical positioning. So now we are seeing this kind of competition, but with some differences, because now the United States has, the advantage in that regard, with some more cultural influence, with economic influence, and now this military reposition in the Caribbean. China is playing on the sides, is not completely involved in that because it's not, its natural area. So, and in the case of the European Union, I think that Europe in general has an important cultural influence in the Caribbean, but is not a major player over there. So I think great powers as China and Russia are trying to compete with the States, but the United States still have, a great advantage over them.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I come from the Dominican Republic, and as a Dominican, I can perceive the close relationship between Caribbean states and the United States, and how it's a sense of loyalty to the United States. And it's very interesting because of the Caribbean's colonial past, how this relationship has been shaped into the future. Can
Well, as you know, I'm based on Colombia, but I'm originally Venezuelan. So we are, from the Caribbean culture, and we know that the Caribbean history has been, penetrated by this, empire competition. And right now, Dominican Republic is in the interesting position, looking for advantage in this, repositioning of the United States, offering airports on military bases.
Yes.
And in the case of Venezuela, it's completely different. Venezuela is, confronting the United States in that regard, but the society, and especially the leadership, is divided, with a majority, of course, following Maria Corina Machado, and a minority with Nicolas Maduro. So our countries are, in the middle of this great power competition.
Yes. About division, you have written extensively on UNASUR, regionalism, and the decline of South American multilateral projects. What lessons can the Caribbean institutions draw from the rise and disintegration of these South American blocs?
Well, the case of UNASUR was an interesting case of trying to put together, important countries, all South American countries, including Suriname and Guyana, non-Latin countries in this strict sense. But those 12 countries, in the end, are so different. considering their interests, their geopolitical position, their history. It's not the same, the case of Brazil or Ecuador. Ecuador is not similar to Suriname. Suriname is completely different than Chile. So it was, an interesting experiment, but with no geopolitical and social, cultural awareness, you know. And I think that it was, a major mistake, considering that they used to want to have, a more political and more commitment unity, considering that they want to, counterbalance the United States power, however, with different, autonomies and different interests. So I think the major lesson of this to the Caribbean is being more pragmatical, not these maximalist, objectives, but looking for functional objectives. The most of the countries in the Caribbean are, part of the Caribbean community, the CARICOM, and they are, working in trying to, get some objectives in terms of, diplomacy, trade, and sometimes security. Now they are divided with this, repositioning of the states. But, I think is the CARICOM is a good example, of what you have to do, and UNASUR is, the counterexample of what is right in terms of regional integration.
Thank you. Given the current fragmentation of regional organizations, what future models of cooperation do you think could be the most effective for Caribbean states?
Wow. The model of integration, I think, should be more oriented to cooperation in terms of security. Security is a major problem
Yeah.
for the Latin American countries, not only the Caribbean, but all Latin America. Uh, Security cooperation should be, of course, a major issue here. But I think we have also, major problems in terms of polarization within the countries and polarization among the countries. Is it's difficult to put, to work together countries like, I don't know, Venezuela and Guyana, for instance. They have, this strong dispute over the Essequibo region. So it could be, difficult for those countries to cooperate. Or put in a same page countries like El Salvador or Mexico, for instance, because Latin American countries in the Caribbean, in Central America, in South America, are now under a lot of pressure because of this polarization, and it is difficult to make that kind of of dialogue in terms of security. There is also the possibility of talking about trade, but we have also a problem in terms of trade because most of the countries in Latin America compete in each other because we are raw material exporters. So the real possibility of complementarity uh, is very low. And in the case of countries with some complementarity in the past, like Colombia and Venezuela, they passed through years and years of conflict, diplomatic conflict, political conflict, and now the trade is ridiculous. It's very small trade. I think the best model for Latin America right now should be, taking all the lessons the region can take from Mercosur. Mercosur is maybe the best model in that regard. It's very pragmatic, is looking for opportunities, and they try always to avoid, political objectives or great geopolitical commitments. Just, moving around trade, moving around legislation moving around cooperation in a very minimalistic but functional and pragmatic way.
As a follow-up question, do you believe dependency theory applies to the Caribbean states?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Maybe not in the original way,
Right.
but there is some not that new, but new waves of dependency theory, and I think it's a very descriptive and very useful theory to understand, of course, how weak countries can navigate the world of this great power competition. So I'm really, committed with this peripheral realism of the Argentinian Carlos Escudé. I think this is you know, a development, a further development from the dependency theory, but with with this particular view about realism and how small and weak countries can actually survive and looking for better conditions for their population in this complicated, conflictive, and very competitive international order.
Thank you. In your analysis of Venezuela's hybrid defense doctrine, what implications does this have for regional security, especially for neighboring countries, states from the Caribbean, given Venezuela's Plan 200?
It's a major issue considering that this hybrid doctrine combines traditional and conventional weapons, as the Russian Sukhoi 30, these airplanes, or missiles defense, like S-300 or Box, but also they has been trying to combine these conventional weapons and doctrines in order to defend themselves with some non-conventional doctrines and weapons. I'm talking about, for instance, the Iglas missiles. These kind of missiles that could be carried by one single man. It looks like a normal normal defense device. But in the case of Venezuela, the Venezuelan regime acquired a lot of these kind of weapons in an area, in a region that is crossed by transnational crime. So in the case of a major conflict around Venezuela, those weapons could be spread around the region, could be spread across the region, and it may be a major problem for especially the neighbors of Venezuela. I'm talking about especially Colombia, but also Brazil and Guyana, and maybe countries in the Caribbean. So I think that this hybrid doctrine is a major threat for the region right now, and we must be careful about the new developments in this crisis in the Caribbean, because Venezuela is in the middle of that crisis.
As a follow-up question, how is Colombia preparing for responding to Plan 200 from Venezuela?
Colombia is not prepared at all for that kind
I
of
understand.
plans. I think Colombia is more involved and aware of its own conflict. Now we are talking about almost eight fronts of war in the case of Colombia. You know, problems in public order, with gangs, with organized crime, but now also criminality from Colombian groups, but also Venezuelan groups, operating in urban areas of Colombia. So now the Gustavo Petro's government is not completely aware of this, or they try to not to confront Maduro in that regard. And the major ally of Colombia, that is the United States, is confronting Gustavo Petro's policy in terms of security. So I think this crisis is is likely to affect, in a important way the stability of the already, little and poor stability of Colombia.
It's also very preoccupying how new groups coming from disintegration of the FARC are maybe also integrating in Venezuela and
Yeah.
how it's spreading.
Yeah, because in the case of FARC, I mean, dissidents of FARC, part of FARC, the former FARC, and the ELN, they are now binational guerrilla, and they're not completely, in the classical terms, they're not guerrilla in that regard, but more organized crime, and they use Venezuela as a territorial platform to take from their, resources. In the case of the ELN, for instance, they have, illegal gold mines
Yes.
in Venezuela, as far as, to the Venezuela's Guyana border. So they cross all the country in that regard. So yes, this is, a major issue, and I think this could be and should be in the future one of the most important aspect and issues that if there will, come any kind of transition in Venezuela, security must be, the paramount objective.
As we explore a public order, corruption and institutional fragility appear in many of your works. How do these factors affect regional security governance?
In an important way, because corruption makes, possible some kind of, weakness of the institutionality. The corruption actually can destroy the capability of the state to deal with, important problems like, poverty, inequality, security, um, and also in my research, corruption could be an important tie between authoritarian states. Corruption is the main tie and the main link between, for instance, the Venezuelan regime and the Russian regime of Vladimir Putin. So corruption is actually a weapon in the international politics. So I think we need to understand better corruption in international studies, for instance. I think international politics and the students of international politics should be more involved in understanding what corruption could do to their countries and, of course, to the international order.
It's a controversial matter. However, some scholars have argued that Latin America and the Caribbean are still transitioning into democracy. What's your take on that?
Well, it's difficult to say that, because now we are transitioning to many things at the same time. In the case of, for instance, in the case of Colombia, is well established, even weak democracy. For instance, is a democracy with, internal conflict. In the case of Venezuela, is an authoritarian regime, but with this important participation of criminality as a way of governance. In the case of most Caribbean countries, there are, democracies, but with, with sometimes poor human rights performance. So I think we need to understand that democracy is in danger in the world, and the model of, liberal democracy that we used to have and we're still talking about in our syllabus, in the schools of international relations, political science, global studies. We need to revise that because we are in risk to say that, this region is still in a transition, but maybe that kind of democracy that, ideal democracy is not anymore on the table. I think even in the case of the states, they have, a huge debate about, the democracy and the future of American democracy. And here in Europe, even within the European Union, they are, some debates about, if the European Union could be, keep together, considering that not all countries share the same concept of democracy. So we need to be more precise in this regard, and knowing that liberal democracy maybe is not anymore in the menu, and to understand better what's going on over there.
Thank you. Based on your writing about China's global discourse strategies, how do you see Beijing shaping narratives from the Caribbean region?
Well, Beijing is not that important, actor in terms of, spreading messages. It's more like an agent, an actor, a power in terms of trade, and in some terms influence, but not in all countries. China has been more interest in the Andean region, for instance, in the case of Chile, Peru, um, and less interest in the Caribbean, except for the case of Venezuela, of course, with these loans and the participation in oil production and trade. And in the case of Guyana, they're trying to to get some influence over there, but it's not a major actor there. I think Russia is trying to be more vocal in that regard, but after the invasion of Ukraine, they are now less and less influent in the region.
Some scholars have challenged China, saying that they're using depth diplomacy in some countries in Africa and as well in the Latin American and the Caribbean. What's your take on it?
Well, they try to do that, but the problem for the Chinese, in the case, at least in the case of Venezuela, is corruption. They try to put Venezuela in a debt trap. But the problem is that Venezuela is so corrupt that the binational fund was completely, looted, and they have no opportunity to have this kind of influence. So also for other countries, they has been, working more in investments and not loans and not, debt. So is the case, for instance, of Chile or Peru, in a lesser, with lesser influence over, for instance, Colombia or Ecuador. However, I think the modus operandi and the influence of China in Latin America is not that strong that they want to be, but they still are there, and trying to compete with the states, but not in the same condition that they are able to compete in Africa or Asia, for instance.
Right. As a scholar, how do you evaluate the current state of academic research in Caribbean international affairs, and what advice would you give to young students in the Caribbean who want to pursue careers or research in international relations and security studies?
I think the Caribbean has been always an interesting region, but with no important and long-standing school of thought, thinking about the Caribbean per se. Always, the Caribbean as a part of Latin America,
Yes.
with this, trying to put all the region in one single category. And I think the Caribbean deserves, a little bit more of focus, considering that, is an area of great power competitions, is fragmented, is diverse. So it's a maritime space. It's many islands, archipelagos. So I think we deserve a better studies of about the Caribbean. And to do that, I think the young students of international relations and politics should be aware that those special conditions of the Caribbean deserve, special attention. Try to, take some lessons, of course, from other regions in the global South. But considering that the Caribbean has its own features and characteristics, I think to understand security as a transnational problem, to understand maritime issues, the law of sea, and the history of great power competition could be, important components for any student of international relations that actually wants to, be an expert on the Caribbean. The Caribbean is, yes, a region, a compact region with many small countries, but if we need to be aware that it's a very complicated region with these, different characteristics and different cultures, and this fragmentation makes the region even more complex.
I appreciate a lot when you say that we should differentiate the Caribbean from the rest of Latin American countries, because in international relations and in universities in general, we encompass them as one whole region. In my perception, is unfair because when we compare countries like Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico to countries like Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, it's the paramount difference between them. It's enormous. So I thank you for that, for saying that we should study the Caribbean region in a very specific way because they have specific requirements and specific conditions. Thank you for today, and thank you for joining us.